So, after the fun and games of 2 weeks working on the V12 Coupe, and of course, by fun and games, what I mean is face-ripping frustration of not getting anything fixed, it was back to the Roadster. And previously, having got the front wings to a position that I would consider to be nearly finished, it was next onto the doors. Now, naturally, because of the nature of this project, I had, of course, previously nearly finished these doors. The issue was, however, that having now fixed positions of the front wings and also the rear wings, the doors as they stand didn't fit anymore. I'd also previously got frustrated with trying to create hidden internal hinges and had gone for some fairly tacky, cheap and nasty looking external ones. At the end of the day, these just didn't really look good and weren't in keeping with the sleek lines of the rest of the car. And so, with you now there, dear viewer, to keep me focused on making sure I can do the best job that can be possibly done, I've decided to re-engineer the hinges to make them work properly. With that all being said, the first job to do was to get rid of the surface rust that had appeared over the last few years. And the keen-eyed amongst you may also have noticed that having started this job, that I had forgotten to put on my welding gauntlets.
It was at this moment that he knew. He f***ed up.
Yeah, so I touched the door after having been grinding it for the last 20 minutes and it was seriously hot. Anyway, I'm a big brave boy, so I picked up the grinder and carried on with the rest of it. Having cleaned up the remains of the previous hinges, I was then able to put the door back into the aperture to see how it fitted. And the answer was not brilliant. Not necessarily bad, but not brilliant. So at that point, I did what all good engineers should do at a time like this, which was to sit there and stare at it for a bit. Having completed this important stage, I then realised that the door wasn't going to fix itself, so I guess I needed to do it. The first job would be to sort out the panel gaps. I need a consistent 3 to 4 millimeter all the way around the door, and it was much less than that in some places, too much in others. Also, the way that I designed the front inner part of the door frame meant that there wasn't room for a hidden hinge, so it was out with the angle grinder to remove all that previous work. One of the previous problems I'd had with other designs for the door hinges was that no matter how carefully I made them, there was always some slop left in the hinges. To get around the issue this time, I'm going to be using rose joints. These are essentially self-aligning pivots with zero slop in them. So with that done, it was time to create a bracket that I could bolt onto the door that the hinges would mount to. The critically important thing with this bracket was to make sure that the two pivot points for the two rose joints were exactly in line with each other. So in order to do this, I designed it in such a way that I could use a single piece of 8mm bar stock running between the two ends of the bracket. I did consider just welding this bracket directly onto the door itself, but I wanted to give myself the opportunity later on for fine adjustment of the panel gaps, and in order to do that, it needed to be bolt-onable. One of the other critical design elements was to make sure that I could get the rose joint body itself as close to the very edge of the door as possible. This allows the door to then pivot around the rose joint without hitting the rest of the bodywork. So, with the first part of the bracket done, it was then time to repeat the process for the other end. So with that all firmly clamped down, it was then time to do the final welding, which was fine right up to the point where my welder tripped the power supply.
Oh, come on!
Never mind. With a bit of trip switch trickery, we were then able to get the welder back online and finish the bracket. With the hinge bracket made, I then realised it would be very important for me to be able to put the door onto the car in the correct position in order to be able to work out where to position the brackets that the rose joints will bolt to. In order to do this, I welded on a tab to the door itself at the front and at the back that I could either clamp on or bolt on to ensure that the door is always in the same position. I did, however, realise at this point that the A-pillar bodywork wasn't fixed strongly enough, and the risk was that I could mount the door and then discover that it doesn't align properly with the A-post. So the solution to this was to create a small infill piece that would join up the A-post itself onto the main scuttle frame. To do this, it was a simple case of shaping a piece of 20mm bar stock so it fit the gap, as well as adjusting the actual gaps between the door and the A-frame to make sure they were even. Just a quick word of warning here, just be very careful to make sure that you're holding the angle grinder extremely tightly if you're ever putting the disc into a narrow gap. I also like to use a full face mask if I'm ever using the angle grinder with a thin disc, just in case they shatter. With the door gap set properly, I then just needed to add a smooth curve onto the A-pillar itself. And in order to be able to do this, I took a piece of 30mm steel bar and smoothed off the edges so that I could hammer around it. Overall, I was pretty happy with the way that fitted, so the next job was to get the welder out and tack it into place. One of the mistakes I've made in the past with this sort of thing is to get too overexcited and weld these bits in permanently too soon. If you then discover somewhere down the line that you've done something wrong, it becomes a massive pain to be able to remove everything in order to do it again properly. With that all in place, it was then just a case of using a flat edge to ensure that the door lines up with the A-post properly. Now, whilst this title won't mean anything to most of you, there's about 3 people of my age watching that would have had a quiet chuckle at this. With the door and the hinge in the right place, it was then time to make the bracket that will weld to the A-post that the hinge itself will bolt to. These brackets are really just 30mm square tabs with a hole drilled in the middle for the rose joint to bolt onto. And whilst I wanted to make the bracket on the door to be bolted on so I can have some fine adjustment, I'm happy for these tabs to be welded as there's just no room to really make them boltable. So with the tabs tacked in place, I could then remove the door and weld them properly. This was all going very well indeed, right up to the part where I needed to complete the final tack on the upper bracket. And just at that point, my welder exploded. Yeah. Fortunately, I had managed to get enough weld on there to be able to very gingerly reattach the door to see if it would open properly. If you remember, at the end of last week's video, dear viewer, my welder had decided to go bang just as I was completing the last tack weld. So, before admitting defeat with it, I decided it was probably worth taking the back off it just to see if I could see anything obviously wrong. Sadly, the simple answer was no, I couldn't, and I didn't have the time at this stage to mess around with it any further, so I switched to my spare welder. Sadly, I don't have any footage of this, but my other welder is in my other workshop about a quarter of a mile from where I do the work on this car. So sadly, you missed the comical sight of me taking a welder for a walk. With the replacement welder safely installed, I was then able to finish the welding job that I started previously last week. I then started the long drawn out process of making fine adjustments to see if I can get the door into the correct place. This involves a lot of very careful adjustment using an angle grinder and a hammer. This didn't work out too badly, but I could then see that there was still quite a lot of flex in the door frame. This was coming from a combination of the A-pillar itself and the two tabs that I welded on. Both needed additional strengthening. So it's time for a welding and grinding montage. So, did it work? Well, kind of. There's still some flex, and this time I could see it was coming from the hinges itself, so it was time to strengthen them. Nice. So all I had to do now was reassemble the hinges back onto the door and put everything back together again. It was at this point I then discovered that you couldn't open the hinges properly anymore. Yeah, my strengthening bracket was now sitting exactly where the hinge needed to fold out to when it was bolted to the door. Fortunately, a few moments with a grinder managed to sort it out and it was all ready to go back together again. Overall, it was much better. There's still some flex, which I'm not quite sure where it's coming from, but I'll have a look at that later because it could be the entire door frame itself is flexing. I was also a bit concerned that the door didn't seem to want to open very far without hitting the A-post. But at this stage, as I was in full-on ostrich mode, I decided to just ignore the problem and assume I could probably adjust it later. So, on the back of that potential false optimism, it was then time to reinstate the door catch at the back. This has, of course, all been previously nearly finished, but as we changed the hinges and changed the position of the door slightly, nothing really fitted exactly. This was really just a case of elongating the holes with the bolts for the latch so I could move them around until everything fitted. As I've learned from previous projects, making opening panels on cars fit is incredibly time-consuming and incredibly difficult. So whilst people, including me, do criticise companies such as McLaren or Tesla for their terrible panel fit, I do feel their pain. However, in this case, did my doors fit? Obviously, at this point, I then realised that I hadn't got the rear wings attached anymore, so I thought I'd better pop them on just to make sure that didn't change anything. So, the lesson that I just don't appear to be able to learn is always reassemble all the panels before you start checking for panel gaps. I discovered that with the rear wing back on the car, the panel gap at the top was too tight and at the bottom was far too wide. So it was a case of get out the angle grinder, start making adjustments and try and make it all fit better. I also noticed that the rear cover itself wasn't actually sitting down properly, so I decided to make some adjustments to that as well. With the door fitting better at the back, I was then able to move on to the next issue, which is it just didn't open very wide. The issue is, in essence, as the door starts to open, the front edge of it actually rotates around the hinges and moves forwards. And the issue is that as it moves forwards into the A-post itself. To fix this, we need to create a sort of gutter for the door to be able to open into. But we also need to strengthen the outer skin of the A-post itself. So the first thing to do was to weld in a small strip of metal in order to do that. With that in place, we could then create and weld in another strip that would connect the A-post to the outer skin. Of course, the keen-eyed amongst you may have noticed that there's quite a big gap at the bottom of that piece, so it was out with the cardboard aided design to make a piece to fill in. So, one lesson I have learned, dear viewer, is to make sure that you let everything cool down before you touch it. So with that important step out of the way, I was then able to reassemble the door onto the car to see how it fitted. Sadly, I can now see that there were issues with the way the door fitted at the top, so I was going to have to remove the brackets that I previously created to allow me to position the door, and then cut away the metal underneath. The other problem I discovered is that whilst the new channel section that I welded in allows the door to open further, the door itself was still hitting the A-post, but now a little bit higher up. And the only way I could see to fix this was to slightly change the shape of where the upper part of the door curves into the lower part. So to do this, it was a case of taking a piece of 6mm steel bar, carefully bending it to form the new shape. So overall, I think the shape looked pretty good, certainly an improvement over what was there before. The big question was, did it work? Did it
it's good to be back.
So, you probably didn't notice because I pre-scheduled the videos, but I've actually been away on holiday for the last 2 weeks. I went to the good old US of A and travelled around for a couple of weeks, including seeing this. It was lovely, thanks. But now I'm back and it's time to get on with cars. So, if you cast your mind back, dear viewer, to the end of last week's video, I just discovered that my brand new reshaped door still didn't open properly. Sadly, I'd come to the conclusion that the only option was radical surgery. I therefore got out the angle grinder and chopped out a large part of the A-post. I then found some 6mm bar and was able to bend it into various shapes to form the new panel edges. Interestingly, this process of using a steel bar to form the edge of a panel and then filling it in later with steel is actually the method that William Lyons used to use himself when he was creating prototype Jaguars. And as William Lyons is a pretty cool dude, if it was good enough for him, it's good enough for me. So the question was, did the new shape work? Yeah, it did actually, pretty well. So it was then on with the next stage of creating the infill panel. This was done with a bit of good old-fashioned cardboard aided design, followed by a bit of good old-fashioned panel beating. Next was a bit of good old-fashioned welding, followed by a bit of good old-fashioned grinding. After all that, it was then time to stand back and take a look.
Nice.
Actually, to be honest, it was only mostly nice. The panel gap at the front was a little bit too wide, so I thought it would just be a simple case of opening up the hinge bolt holes so that we could move the entire door a little bit further forwards. Sadly, having done this, I then discovered that the rose joints themselves, if you move them forward, hit the A-post. Fortunately, there was a relatively simple solution to this, and a few moments with the belt sander saw the problem solved.
Great.
With the front of the door sorted out, I could then turn my attention to sorting out the panel gaps at the back of the door. I made a few small adjustments with the grinder, but the biggest problem was where the back of the door butted up alongside the lifting rear panel. Having moved the entire door forward, there is now a huge gap at the back. So the solution was to get out the 6mm bar again, bend it in shape, and add a bit to the back of the door.
Tell sleep at night with all the things you've done. Maybe it's just gin and justifications. Tell me how you pray to gods whose hands are red with blood. As pretty as you are, it's pretty sad what you've become. Don't try to come and save my soul. Don't try to pray to bring me home. It's the last time you'll see me, last time to God. You're beautiful, you're sick inside, and I'm not. Tell me how you do it. Maybe I could learn from you how to take the hate and ignorance and make it a virtue. You just make it look so easy. Yeah, you make it look so good. You're the victim with a shotgun. Hate so pretty, so misunderstood. Don't try to come and save my soul. Don't try to pray to bring me home. It's the last time you'll see me, last time to God. You're beautiful, you're sick inside, and I'm not. Like Joan of Arc without the flames, like Jesus Christ without the pain. Just come down off that cross, you're not the same.
Wonderful. So, messing around with that lot took nearly all the time that I had that weekend. However, there was just a little time left to move back to the A-post to finish up a welding job that I'd never previously finished. So as I've shown you elsewhere in this video, the way I create all my panels is to start with a wireframe outline and then create a steel panel to go in between. And the lesson I have learned painfully many times over with creating this car is don't seam weld everything until you're completely sure it's the right shape. However, now we've got the door to fit and the bonnet also fits pretty well, I think the time had come to seam weld everything at the front. So this is future me recording the audio in the normal way that I do at some point long after I've left the garage. However, there's been lots of comments recently relating to the reasons why I've designed the hinges the way that I have. Now these are all really valid and very interesting comments and questions. So rather than the usual format of me talking over the top of lots of video interspersed between the film clips and the music that everybody absolutely always loves without question, I thought this time I would let present me talk to you from the actual workshop. So, there's been lots of comments online about why exactly did I design the hinges to be like this. So there have been lots of suggestions as well about alternative hinge designs and why didn't I do them this way or that way. So I thought I would be actually speaking to you today from within the workshop and take you through some of the prototype ideas I did try that didn't work and the reasons for that. So one of the suggestions was to do something along the lines of, if the door is there, bodywork is there, you have a hinge point there with something that goes like that. So basically that can hinge out and you don't get the issue with the bodywork hitting around there. So part of the issue I've got is that, I'll get my hand in there, this 8-post that's here was something that was designed about 20 years ago, and it seemed to be in the right place at the right time. The problem is, it turns out it's not really in the right place, so any hinge has to pivot from the other side of that. And before anybody suggests, why don't I just move it, the problem is it's tied in to the entire bulkhead structure, and that would be nearly impossible to do. Now, sitting underneath that tarpaulin cover up there is actually my Cobra replica, and that in fact does use this sort of gooseneck design for door hinges. So when I first started putting together ideas for the doors and the hinges, that's exactly the design that I did in fact try to use, and they look a bit like this. Now I actually think they look quite neat. You know, I like the retro design of it. It's in keeping with the rest of the car. The problem was, when I put them on the car, the door flexes. These doors are actually really long, and due to the shape of the bodywork, those hinges can only be so far apart from each other in order for them to actually work. Now, in reality, it probably wouldn't actually be too much of a problem if there's a tiny bit of flex. But, you know, it doesn't feel like a professional, well-made product if you lean on the door and it bends. So, doing those hinges, that didn't work. The obvious thing to do is make a stronger version. And that's where this monstrosity comes in. Basically, I started off by using some door hinge shape and then continually adding more and more strength into it to try and stop the overall flexing. The problem was, despite all that ironmongery, by the time I got that back on the car, it still flexed. Much better than the other design, but it still flexed. So that is why we ended up going for the design that we did. But again, some of the questions are, why do it that way? So this is actually a regular modern hatchback, and if we open the door and actually have a look at the way that Volkswagen have done hinges, you can see that it is in fact exactly the same way as I'm building the hinges for this car. And what that means is, as the door opens, the front face of the door actually slides slightly inside the A-post, which is exactly the same as happens on the project car. And as future me explains in a forthcoming video, I've actually managed to tighten up the panel gap so they are pretty much exactly the same as on the Golf. Now, one of the other suggestions in the comments was, why not do Lambo type doors? The sort of door that you see on top of the range Lamborghini, so a door that basically hinges upwards rather than outwards. So in order to do a Lamborghini style door, the hinge point is somewhere around here, and basically the door hinges up that way. Two issues with that. First of all, this is the windscreen post. So if you actually look at a Lamborghini, the way their doors work is the bit that actually covers that is on the door, because the door has to shut onto it from this way. So the door rubber needs to go over the top of it. So basically the door can open on top of it that way. It also means if you've got a window behind here, which I am looking to potentially do, that window can't, actually the door can't open because the window hits here. So you end up with a very strange shape A-post windscreen pillar in order for the door to be able to shut over the top of it. The other issue is that if the pivot point is up here, then basically this bit of the door here, as that hinges up, that rotates backwards and would hit into the rear wing. So basically you'd need to have some other sort of swervy, curvy design around here for that door design to work. The other thing is that, this is a 1930s style car. Lamborghini doors weren't invented till 1970s. So, whilst I like the idea of it, I think it's cool, I don't think it would actually work on this designer car. I think it looked really weird. And in fact, I did actually do a Lamborghini style door on my Triumph GT6. And after having done it, I hated it so much, I got rid of it again. So another idea was to do a suicide door. That is a door that hinges at the back. And again, this is very in keeping with this style of car. So, it wouldn't look out of place at all. There are, again, a couple of problems. Firstly, in order for this to work, this is the width of the door that I've got at the back. So if the hinge were to live in here, it would only be about half the width, half the height of something like this. That is far too tall. It can only be about that big. And as that flexed, doing half of it is going to flex even worse. So I don't know whether it would be viable that you could ever make anything in steel that would actually be able to support a door that big and heavy with a pivot that's only a maximum of that height. So I think that in itself is probably a no-go. The other problem is, in the UK, it is legal just to be able to have suicide doors. If you look at modern Rolls Royces, they do it. But it's not as simple as the type of door we've got here, where you just need a 2-position catch and then you're good to go. To do suicide doors in the UK and make them legal, you have to first of all have the mechanical lock, but then you also need to have a sort of interlock mechanism that automatically means that the doors cannot be opened while the vehicle's in motion. And that means potentially some more complicated electronics and more complicated hardware. Now, I can do that. I have got the capabilities of doing that. I could build the circuitry, I could build the electronics, and I could build the mechanical process for doing it. But it's an awful lot of work, and you're still relying on the person that is going to do the actual inspection to get the vehicle registered, believing that your stuff works. So it's not really practical, and at this stage I'm trying to get to a situation where the car is more finished, rather than just being vaguely finished, nearly finished. So I don't really want to go to that level of complexity on the off chance that some guy in a brown lab coat somewhere down the line takes one look at it and goes, nah, don't like it, I'm not going with it. So I think sadly suicide doors are out. I would like to have done them, but it's not going to work. So one of the questions from the comments was about my decision to use these sort of rose joints for the hinges, and are they likely to wear out? 2 reasons why I use them. First of all, they have absolutely zero slop in them, and in other designs that I've done, so for example these, I'm building my own bushes and things, and whilst they're all right, these have no slop in them whatsoever. With regards to them wearing out, they might wear out, but I use these on my virtual reality motion platforms. We use them for everything, both 8mm, 10mm, sort of bigger ones even still. And in years of using these things, the only time I've ever had one wear out is when basically we damaged it. Other than that, these things are designed to rotate for a very, very long time. If they do wear out, they're only £8 a pair, so it's not the end of the world to just change them if I need to. but I just don't think realistically the number of times a car door gets opened that they're gonna wear out. I could also, if I need to, I could use bigger ones, but I think these will do. So it's a bit of a departure from the usual videos that I've been making. It'd be interested to hear from people what they think about me talking directly to the camera like this versus the edits and all the usual rubbish with the music and the film clips and all that sort of stuff. So let me know what you think about this. Hopefully that gives you a bit of a better understanding about the thought processes that have gone into making these doors. Comments and suggestions from people are always welcome. I'm glad I can make this video to talk about some of the things that I have tried in the past with this. So please keep the comments going. I don't have a monopoly on all the ideas. So if somebody's come up with a great idea, stick it in the comments. I do read every single one. I reply to every single comment, and I do consider every single comment. So let me know what you think. I can do a few more bits like this in the future if you like it. Alternatively, we'll stick with Henry Cavill saying. So this is future me again, speaking to you some point after I recorded all this footage. But as it's a nearly finished car building video, I guess we better actually show some car building. So last time, having got to the position where the door shuts pretty well, it was then time to start working out how we actually get the door rubbers to fit. This is one of those areas in car design that sounds actually pretty simple, but in reality can be a bit of a nightmare. And real car designers spend a fortune having lots of bespoke rubber extrusions created in order to make car doors seal properly. Unfortunately, I don't have that luxury, so I'm stuck using rubber extrusions that look a bit like this. And the problem that I've got is that with the door catch where it is at the moment, it's sitting exactly where this rubber needs to seal against the door. And if you're playing the nearly finished drinking game, Henry Cavill has spoken, so take a shot now. So I looked to see whether I could make the door rubber seal against a different part of the door, maybe bypassing the door latch. Sadly, this wasn't going to work. So the only thing left to do is move the door catch further up the door, out of the way of the door rubbers. And you know what? It does fit pretty well up here. So that, I think, is going to be its new home. By moving it up there, there was also a good opportunity to clean up this monstrosity that currently lives on the back of the lifting boot panel. I had originally envisaged that some of the door sealing rubber would actually have to live on this lifting panel. But by moving the pivot point and changing the way that the door rubbers are going to work, I can do away with that in its entirety. And the biggest benefit of making that change is that it now means that the rear lifting panel can open and close without having to open the doors first. So this is about where the door latch needs to end up. And in order to do that, we need to do some cardboard aided design and shape a panel for it to bolt onto. Now I know as well from the comments, there's some people that are not the biggest fans of the music, and I understand that. Music is a very personal choice. However, sometimes there is only so much stuff I can talk about whilst I cut and grind metal panels. I also, very much with this channel, don't want to get into the Blue Peter way of doing things, where I just suddenly magically go, and here's one I created earlier. I also want to keep the fabrication process that I'm going through very grounded. So I don't just break out my laser scanner, upload some CAD designs into my £1 million water jet, and then just magically have produced some bits to weld onto the car. Nearly everything you see me do on this car can be done at home with relatively basic tools. Okay, I happen to have a fairly high quality welder, but you can do it with a much cheaper device. Anyway, the point that I'm waffling towards making is that sometimes I just need to show a montage of what can be quite a long period of time that I've spent fabricating a panel. So I'm afraid you're sort of stuck with the montage music. However, I won't be offended in any way whatsoever if you want to skip forward to the end of this bit. So with the latch in the right place, I then needed to make a bracket for the catch to bolt onto. So this was a very similar process of making a template with some cardboard, finding some flat bar stock, doing some cutting, doing some drilling, and doing some welding. And I'm very pleased to say that having measured everything twice, as you should always do, cut once, welded the bracket together, it did of course fit perfectly. Take a drink, and Garage Me will get back to making some adjustments. So, did it fit now? Actually, this one wasn't too much of a problem to fix. So I was out with the drill and the rotary burrs and essentially just overlapped the slot where the door latch peg bolts to, so I can move it across about 4 or 5 millimeters. So there we go. The door's in the right place. It opens and shuts with a latch that works quite well, and we're in a position where we can start to design next time how the door rubbers actually fit. So I'm very pleased to say that this will be the final part of this series about working on the doors. As this channel is of course called Nearly Finished, they won't be completely done, but certainly done enough for this stage of the project. Anyway, enough of that. We need to get on with making the internal panels for the door rubbers to attach to. Now, in a previous prototype version, I made these out of steel, but the process is very complicated and the shapes are just a bit difficult to easily do that way. Now, I also know that some of you are missing the good old early days of this channel where we did everything in fiberglass and basically I spent most of the time itching. So, as a special tribute to all the day one early visitors to this channel, we're making these internal panels out of fiberglass. Sadly, fiberglass doesn't stick particularly well to air. So in order to make these panels, we have to have something to mold the fiberglass against. So to do this, I made a basic template out of plywood and then covered it with good old duct tape. And also, with the door in place, I was able to make sure that I had an exact 2 centimeter gap between the door and this new panel. So with that done, it was then simply a case of mixing up a batch of fiberglass and letting the sticky bit begin.
It was at this moment that he knew. He fucked up.
Yeah, so that's the thing that happened then. So I've still got no real idea what went pop, but some of the wiring to the back of the ignition switch that I'd left lying on the central console seemed to have been a bit melted, so I'm assuming something shorted out. Either way, it is really quite disturbing when a large cloud of smoke emits from your backside and you haven't even had a particularly strong curry the night before. Anyway, with that drama out the way, I could then get on with the process of removing the fiberglass from the car and tidying up the rough edges. So obviously there's a few bits and pieces to tidy up on the fiberglass panel, particularly where the clamps went, but overall it was pretty good and certainly usable. So with that nearly finished, I could then turn my attention to the next section of where the door rubber needs to go. And fortunately, there was a steel lip that I'd left here previously that I could now bend over before I managed to weld on then an upright piece for the door rubber itself to go on. So with that carefully clamped in place to ensure the 2 centimeter gap that I need between the door and the door rubber, I was then able to get the welder out and permanently attach it to the car. Having, of course, previously gone through many different designs to try and resolve the issue of flex appearing within the door hinges, and whilst the version that we've got here is infinitely better than the other designs, there was still the possibility of a tiny bit of flex left. So I took this opportunity to weld in some extra strengthening material just to make sure that that issue was completely resolved. With that all done, it was then simply a case of repeating the process that we did at the back of the door in order to start being able to mould the necessary panel for the front of the door.
Tell me how you sleep at night with all the things you've done. Maybe it's just gin and justifications. Tell me how you pray to gods whose hands are red with blood. As pretty as you are, it's pretty sad what you've become. Don't try to come and save my soul. Don't try to pray to bring me home. It's the last time you'll see me, last time to God. You're beautiful, you're sick inside, and I'm not. Tell me how you do it. Maybe I could learn from you how to take the hate and ignorance and make it a virtue. You just make it look so easy. Yeah, you make it look so good. You're the victim with a shotgun. Hate so pretty, so misunderstood. Don't try to come and save my soul. Don't try to pray to bring me home. It's the last time you'll see me, last time to God. You're beautiful, you're sick inside, and I'm not like Joan of Arc without the flames, like Jesus Christ without the pain.
So before I got on with the second round of fiberglassing at the front of the door, I realised there was an opportunity to complete a similar process at the back, just to be able to tie the back of the panel I created into the rear bulkhead. Right, we were really making progress at this stage. Now, at the front, there was one small extra job to do, and that is to weld in a small piece between the upright panel that we welded on earlier and the A-post. So this was simply a case of get out a small piece of 20mm bar stock, shape it, bend it, and weld it. While the welder was out, there were an extra couple of small panels that needed to be made to fit to the door, and these were there just to ensure that the door rubber itself always had a flat surface to close against, and always maintained the 20mm gap between the door and where the door rubber attaches. So, there you go. I think that marks a suitable place to draw a conclusion to the first part of creating the doors. Overall, the driver's door now fits better than it's ever done. It opens and closes properly, and there's something for the door rubbers to attach to so that door will seal nicely when it closes. We could of course go on with the process of spending the next 6 weeks doing exactly the same process on the passenger side door. But I think that would be very boring for you, dear viewer, to have to sit through all this tedium all over again. So my cunning plan is to say that for the moment is doors nearly finished enough, and let's get on with something a lot more entertaining. Let's build the interior.